In my 25 years as a detective, I've seen things that would break most people. But these 5 cases, these destroyed us. Tonight, you'll hear the stories that made even the most hardened investigators break down and cry. Stories that changed British policing forever. Stories that broke the hearts of millions. Case 1. It was August 4th, 2002, in a small town called Soham in England. 2 best friends, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, were having the best summer ever. Both girls were 10 years old and did everything together. That Sunday, Holly's family was having a backyard barbecue. Jessica came over to join the fun. The girls were super excited because they were both wearing their favorite Manchester United soccer jerseys, the red ones that matched perfectly. At 5:04 p.m., someone took a photo of them together. They were smiling, happy, and looked just like any other kids on summer vacation. Nobody knew this would be the last picture ever taken of them. The girls decided to walk to the local shop to buy some candy. It was a short walk, the kind kids in small towns do all the time. Their parents said okay because Soham was a safe, quiet place where everyone knew everyone. On their way, they walked past a house near their school. A man named Ian Huntley lived there. He worked as the school caretaker, someone who fixes things and keeps the building clean. He was someone the community trusted. The girls stopped to talk to him, and then they disappeared. This wasn't a scary movie or a made-up story. This was real life in a normal town. Holly and Jessica weren't doing anything wrong or dangerous. They were just being kids, walking to get candy on a sunny Sunday afternoon. Their families waited for them to come home. Minutes turned into hours. Hours turned into a nightmare that would shock the entire United Kingdom. What happened next would make even the toughest police officers cry. It would change laws across Britain, and it would break the hearts of millions of people who watch the news, hoping and praying these 2 best friends would come home safely. But they never did. My dear friend, before we jump into this tragic story, I ask you to take several important actions. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story. Every single share reaches more people who might recognize these warning signs and save a child. In the comments, write your city and viewing time. This helps me understand when it's best to publish similar investigations so they reach the maximum number of people and can save children's lives. My channel does well to bring you stories about children who needed protection but didn't get it. Each such investigation is not just a story about tragedy. It's a lesson in recognizing dangerous situations. Be sure to watch other videos on the channel because knowing about cases like these could one day help you notice warning signs and protect a child who's in danger. Thank you for your support. The moment Holly and Jessica didn't come home, everything changed. Their parents called the police immediately. Within hours, the entire town of Soham was searching. By the next morning, all of Britain knew their names. A senior police detective named David Beck took charge of the search. He was an experienced officer who had solved many cases before. But this one was different. These were 2 little girls who had simply walked to the shop and never came back. For 13 days straight, Britain stopped everything to look for Holly and Jessica. Here's what happened. Over 400 police officers worked on the case. They searched every house, every garden, every field. Helicopters flew overhead with heat-sensing cameras. Police dogs sniffed through forests and parks. Officers worked 20-hour shifts without going home. The community came together. Thousands of volunteers joined the search. People searched day and night, even in the dark. Local businesses closed so owners could help neighbors who had never spoken before, worked side by side. Everyone wore yellow ribbons to show they cared. The weather made it harder. It was one of the hottest summers on record. Temperatures hit 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees.
Police officers in heavy uniforms searched through thick forests and muddy fields. They were exhausted, sweating, and heartbroken, but they never stopped looking. Every day, Detective Beck stood in front of TV cameras and spoke to the nation. His job was to stay calm and professional, but as the days went on, something changed. His voice started to crack when he spoke. You could see tears forming in his eyes. During one press conference, he had to pause and take a deep breath before continuing. "We will find these girls," he said, his voice shaking. "We will bring them home." Everyone watching could tell. This wasn't just a job for him anymore. He cared deeply. The whole police team did. While everyone searched, a man kept appearing on TV to help. His name was Ian Huntley, the school caretaker whose house the girls had walked past. He gave interviews to reporters. He talked about how worried he was. He said he had seen the girls that day and they seemed happy. He even helped volunteers search the fields. The police didn't know it yet, but they were looking at the person responsible. He was hiding in plain sight, pretending to care while the whole country searched. Britain became obsessed with finding Holly and Jessica. Here's what happened across the country. News channels showed their photos. 24/7, millions of people put up missing posters. Churches held prayer vigils every night. Schools taught kids about staying safe. Parents hugged their children tighter. Strangers cried watching the news. Why detectives started breaking down. As each day passed without finding the girls, the police team grew more desperate. Officers who had children of their own couldn't stop thinking, what if this was my daughter? They searched in the blazing heat. They worked without sleep. They followed every single tip, even the ones that seemed impossible. Because somewhere, 2 families were waiting. 2 mothers were crying. 2 fathers were praying. And 400 police officers were carrying that weight on their shoulders. Detective Beck later said, "We felt like we were failing. Every hour that passed, we felt like we were letting those families down." On August 17th, day 13 of the search, everything changed. A police officer found something in a ditch near an airbase, miles away from Soham. It was the moment that would break Detective Beck's heart and make millions of people across Britain cry. On August 17th, 2002, exactly 13 days after Holly and Jessica disappeared, a police officer was searching near an old airbase about 10 miles from Soham. It was a remote area with ditches and overgrown grass that nobody usually visited. Then he saw something that made his heart sink. He had found the girls, but it was too late. Holly and Jessica were gone. The truth comes out. Within hours, the police knew exactly what had happened, and the truth was worse than anyone imagined. Ian Huntley, the school caretaker who had been on TV helping search for the girls, was arrested. He was the one responsible for their deaths. He had murdered both Holly and Jessica. But here's what made it even more shocking. He had been lying to everyone the entire time. The deception that destroyed trust. Think about this for a moment. While parents cried on TV begging for their daughters to come home, while 400 police officers searched in the burning heat, while millions of people across Britain prayed and hoped, while Detective Beck's voice cracked with emotion during press conferences, Ian Huntley was standing right there, pretending to care. He gave interviews to reporters, looking sad and concerned. He talked to volunteers helping with the search. He even spoke to the police, acting like he wanted to help find the girls, all while knowing exactly what he had done. The girlfriend's lie. It got worse. Huntley's girlfriend, a woman named Maxine Carr, lied to protect him. She told police that Huntley was with her when the girls disappeared, giving him what's called an alibi. She knew he was lying. She knew the girls had been at their house, but she lied to the police anyway, two people working together to deceive an entire nation. When detectives broke down, Detective Superintendent David Beck, the man who had led the search with such determination, was devastated. He later described it as the worst day of my career. Imagine working 13 days straight, barely sleeping, giving everything you have to find two little girls, then discovering that the person you'd been talking to, the person who seemed so helpful, was the one responsible all along. Beck wasn't alone in his pain. Multiple police officers needed professional counseling after the case. Some couldn't sleep for weeks, having nightmares about what happened. Officers with daughters of their own struggled to cope. The entire investigation team carried psychological scars. One detective said, "I've been a police officer for 20 years. I've seen terrible things. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for this level of deception." When the trial happened, Detective Beck had to testify about the investigation. As he spoke about those 13 days of searching, about talking to Huntley while not knowing the truth, his voice broke again. Other officers testified too. They described how it felt to realize they'd been fooled, how it felt to know that while they were searching fields in the heat, the person responsible was watching them on TV. The psychological damage was real. Some officers said they'd never trust people the same way again. Others said they still think about Holly and Jessica every single day. Detectives are trained to handle difficult situations. They see sad and terrible things as part of their job. But this case was different because the victims were children, the same age as many officers' own kids. The deception was complete. Huntley fooled everyone, including experienced detectives. The whole nation watched. Millions of people were emotionally invested. They'd spoken to the killer. Officers had looked Huntley in the eye, believing he was innocent. One senior officer later said, "We felt betrayed, we felt foolish, but most of all, we felt like we'd failed those two little girls and their families." Ian Huntley was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Maxine Carr was convicted of lying to police, but the damage was done. The case changed how British police investigate missing children. It changed how they interview witnesses. It changed everything. Detectives who'd seen everything in their careers said nothing prepared them for this level of deception. Two innocent girls. 13 days of hope. One devastating betrayal. But this wasn't the only case that would devastate British investigators. In fact, this was just the beginning of a decade that would test the emotional limits of every detective in the UK. Case 2. Sarah Payne. A sister's nightmare. A perfect summer day turns into horror. It was July 1st, 2000, in West Sussex, England. 8-year-old Sarah Payne was having the best kind of summer day, the kind every kid dreams about. She was playing in a cornfield near her grandparents' house with her brothers and sister. The sun was shining. The air was warm. Everything felt safe and normal. Sarah was wearing a little black dress. She was laughing and running through the tall corn with her siblings. Her older brother Lee, who was 13 years old, was watching over the younger kids like big brothers do. Then, in just seconds, everything went wrong. A white van appeared near the field. Sarah was there one moment and gone the next. Lee saw it happen. He saw the van. He saw his little sister disappear, and he did what any brave big brother would do. He ran after it as fast as he could. He ran and ran, his legs pumping, his heart pounding. But he couldn't catch up. The van was too fast. Sarah was gone. Imagine being 13 years old and watching your little sister vanish. Imagine running as hard as you can, but not being fast enough. Lee would later say words that broke everyone's heart. "I should have run faster." But here's the truth. There was nothing more he could have done. He was just a kid himself. A brave kid who tried his best. Sarah's parents, Sarah and Michael Payne, were nearby when it happened. Within minutes, they knew something was terribly wrong. Their daughter had been playing in a field, a safe place where kids play every summer. And now she was gone. They called the police immediately. The panic in their voices was real. Every parent's worst fear had just come true. Sarah wasn't doing anything dangerous. She was playing with her siblings in broad daylight, near family, in a place that should have been safe. But someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting. And in just a few seconds, an entire family's life changed forever. What happened next would launch one of the biggest police investigations in British history. And what detectives would discover would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The moment Sarah Payne disappeared, something incredible happened. Thousands of people dropped everything to help find her. Within hours, police officers, volunteers, neighbors, and complete strangers were searching every field, every forest, every street in West Sussex. Nobody went home, nobody gave up. This wasn't just a police investigation anymore. This was an entire community saying, "We will find this little girl." A senior police officer named Detective Inspector Martin Underhill was put in charge of finding Sarah. He was experienced and tough, the kind of detective who had solved many difficult cases before. But this case was different. This was an 8-year-old girl who had been playing with her siblings. This was every parent's nightmare. D.I. Underhill knew something that made his job even harder. Time was running out. For 17 days straight, the search for Sarah never stopped. Here's what happened. Hundreds of officers worked around the clock. Helicopters with special cameras flew overhead. Police dogs searched through forests and fields. Divers checked every pond and river. Officers knocked on thousands of doors. The community came together. Volunteers organized massive search parties. Local businesses closed so people could help look. Thousands of people handed out missing posters. Churches held candlelight vigils every single night. Strangers hugged and cried together, praying for Sarah, the suspect they couldn't ignore. Early in the investigation, detectives identified a man named Roy Whiting. He had a criminal record. He had hurt a child before and had been in prison for it. Police knew he lived in the area. They knew he drove a white van, just like the one Sarah's brother Lee had seen. But knowing someone is suspicious and proving they did something are two very different things. The police needed evidence. Every day, D.I. Underhill stood in front of TV cameras and spoke to the nation. At first, his voice was strong and confident. "We will find Sarah," he said. "We're doing everything we can." But as the days passed, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, 10 days, something changed. His voice started to crack. His eyes looked tired. You could see the weight of the investigation crushing him. During one press conference, he had to pause and take a deep breath. His hands were shaking slightly as he held his notes. He later said, "Every hour that passed, we felt we were failing her." The police team working on Sarah's case were experiencing something they'd never felt before, a growing sense of dread. They knew the statistics. They knew that the longer a child is missing, the less likely they are to be found alive. Every detective on the team was thinking the same thing, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Special police officers were assigned to stay with Sarah's parents, Sarah and Michael. These officers, called family liaison officers, had the hardest job of all. They sat with the family every single day. They watched Sarah's mother cry. They saw her father pace back and forth, unable to sit still. They played with Sarah's siblings who kept asking, "When is Sarah coming home?" These officers weren't just doing a job anymore. They had bonded with the Payne family. They cared deeply, and they were carrying the family's pain on their own shoulders. One officer later said, "I went home every night and hugged my own children. Then I cried in the shower where my family couldn't hear me. Every evening, as the sun set, something beautiful and heartbreaking happened. Hundreds of people gathered in the town center holding candles. They stood in silence. They prayed. They hoped. Complete strangers held hands and cried together. Sarah's face was everywhere, on posters on TV and newspapers. The entire nation knew her name. Everyone was waiting. Everyone was hoping. Day 17, on July 17th, 2000, exactly 17 days after Sarah disappeared, a man walking in a field about 15 miles away from where she vanished found something. It was the discovery that would devastate Detective Underhill, break the hearts of the officers who'd searched for so long, and make millions of people across Britain cry. The 17-day vigil was over, but the pain was just beginning. Tears that changed the law. The discovery that broke everyone. On July 17th, 2000, 17 days after Sarah disappeared, a man was walking through a field about 15 miles from where she vanished. He saw something that made him immediately call the police. Sarah had been found. But she was gone. The little girl in the black dress who had been playing in the cornfield with her siblings would never come home. The candlelight vigils, the thousands of volunteers, the desperate searches. It was all too late. Detective Inspector Martin Underhill, the man who had led the search for 17 days, received the news. He had to be the one to tell Sarah's parents. Imagine having to knock on a door and tell a mother and father that their daughter is never coming home. The man who should have been stopped. Within days, police arrested Roy Whiting, the man they'd suspected from the beginning. The evidence was clear. He had murdered Sarah. But here's what made this case even more devastating. Roy Whiting had done this before. He had been in prison for hurting another child. The police knew he was dangerous. The system knew he was dangerous. But he had been released from prison and was free to live wherever he wanted. Nobody in Sarah's neighborhood knew a dangerous person was living nearby. Nobody could protect their children because nobody knew. When detectives broke down, when the trial happened, Detective Inspector Underhill had to testify in court. He had to talk about the investigation, about the 17 days of searching, about finding Sarah. As he spoke, something happened that shocked everyone in the courtroom. This tough, experienced detective, a man who had seen terrible things in his career, started crying. Not just a few tears. He broke down completely. He said words that would echo across Britain. We knew he was dangerous. We couldn't stop him. The guilt that haunted them. Think about what these detectives were feeling. They had worked 17 days without rest, searching desperately for Sarah. They had suspected Roy Whiting from the beginning. They knew he had hurt a child before. But they couldn't arrest him without evidence. They couldn't warn Sarah's family because the law didn't allow it. One officer said, "I have a daughter. Sarah's age. Every time I look at her, I think about what we couldn't prevent." Another said, "We did everything right according to the law. But a little girl still died. How do you live with that?" Here's the terrible truth that made detectives cry. If Sarah's parents had known that a convicted child sex offender lived nearby, they might have been more careful. They might have watched their children more closely. They might have made different choices. But the law said that information had to be kept secret. Parents had no right to know if dangerous people lived in their neighborhood. Roy Whiting had been released from prison and was free to live anywhere. He chose to live near families with children, and nobody could warn them. When tears changed everything, Detective Underhill's breakdown in court wasn't just about sadness. It was about frustration. It was about a system that tied the hands of police officers trying to protect children. But something incredible happened because of those tears. The entire nation watched detectives cry. They heard officers talk about their guilt and helplessness. They saw how much these tough men and women cared about protecting children, and people said, "This can never happen again." Sarah's Law, a legacy. Born from tears. Because of what happened to Sarah, and because of the emotional testimony from detectives, Britain created something called Sarah's Law. Here's what it means. Parents now have the right to ask police if someone with access to their children has a record of child sex offenses. If a dangerous person lives in your neighborhood, you can know about it. You can protect your children. You can make informed choices. This law has protected millions of children across Britain. It's used thousands of times every year by parents who want to keep their kids safe. Detective Underhill and his team couldn't save Sarah. That guilt will stay with them forever. But their tears, their testimony, their willingness to show emotion and demand change, that saved countless other children. Roy Whiting was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He will never be released. But more importantly, because of Sarah, because of her family's campaign, and because of detectives who cried in court and demanded change, the system was fixed. Sometimes, a detective's tears can change a nation. Sarah Payne's case proved that even in the darkest tragedy, there can be a legacy of protection. Her name now represents a law that keeps children safe. But some investigations don't end in days or weeks. Some last nearly a decade. And the emotional toll on detectives? That can be even worse. Case 3. Millie Dowler, the girl who vanished. A normal Thursday afternoon, March 21, 2002, Walton-on-Thames, Surrey, England. It was just a regular Thursday. Kids were getting out of school, heading home for dinner. Parents were starting to think about what to cook. Everything felt normal and safe. 13-year-old Amanda Dowler, everyone called her Millie, was walking home from school, just like she did every single day. She was wearing her school uniform. She was carrying her saxophone because she had music lessons. She was probably thinking about homework, or what she'd have for dinner, or maybe texting her friends. Millie was a normal teenager doing a normal thing, walking home from school. The route she knew by heart. Millie took the same route home every day. She knew every street, every corner, every shortcut. Here's what her journey looked like. She got off the train at Walton-on-Thames station at 3:47 p.m. She walked to the bus stop to wait for her bus. At 4 p.m., she was seen at the bus stop by several people. Her house was only 400 yards away, and that's about 4 football fields. It should have taken her less than 10 minutes to walk home. 400 yards from safety. Think about that for a second. Millie was 400 yards from her front door. That's the length of 4 football fields. She could probably see her street from where she was standing. She was so close to home, so close to safety, so close to her mom and dad waiting for her, but she never made it. When parents start to worry. Millie's parents, Bob and Sally Dowler, were at home waiting for their daughter like they did every Thursday afternoon. At first, they weren't worried. Kids run late sometimes. Maybe she stopped to talk to a friend. Maybe she missed the bus and had to wait for the next one. But then, 10 minutes passed, then 20 minutes, then 30 minutes. Bob and Sally started calling Millie's mobile phone. No answer. They called her friends. "Have you seen Millie?" Nobody had. They looked out the window, hoping to see her walking up the street. She wasn't there. The panic that every parent fears. If you've ever been late coming home, you might remember your parents being upset or worried. That's because parents' minds go to scary places when their children don't come home on time. Bob and Sally were experiencing every parent's worst nightmare. Their daughter, who was always responsible, always on time, wasn't answering her phone and wasn't home. At 7 p.m., 3 hours after Millie should have arrived home, Bob and Sally called the police. The words they said were shaking with fear. "Our daughter is missing. She was walking home from school. She never arrived." The girl everyone loved. Millie wasn't just any teenager. She was special. She played the saxophone and loved music. She was kind to everyone at school. She had a big smile that made people happy. She was close to her older sister Gemma, who was 15. Her teachers said she was a good student who worked hard. Her friends said she was funny and loyal. Her parents said she was their sunshine. She was the kind of kid who did everything right, went to school, came home on time, stayed out of trouble. The haunting question. Here's what made this case so terrifying from the very beginning. Millie disappeared in broad daylight, on a route she walked every single day, just 400 yards from her house, in a safe neighborhood. If this could happen to Millie, a responsible teenager walking home from school in the afternoon, it could happen to anyone. What police knew immediately. When police arrived at the Dowler house that evening, they asked the questions they always ask. Did Millie have any problems at school? No. Did she have any reason to run away? No. Was she upset about anything? No. Did she have a boyfriend or any conflicts? No. Every answer pointed to the same terrifying conclusion. Millie didn't run away. Something bad had happened to her. The search begins. Within hours, police officers were searching the route Millie had walked. They used flashlights to look in bushes, behind buildings and alleyways. They knocked on doors asking, "Did you see a teenage girl in a school uniform carrying a saxophone?" Some people had seen her at the bus stop at 4 p.m., but after that, nothing. It was like she had vanished into thin air. The agonizing wait. That first night, Bob and Sally Dowler didn't sleep. They sat by the phone, hoping it would ring. They kept Millie's mobile phone number on redial, calling over and over, hoping she'd answer. Sally kept going to Millie's bedroom, looking at her things, touching her clothes, praying she'd walk through the door. Bob kept replaying the morning in his head. He'd said goodbye to Millie before school. She'd smiled and waved. He had no idea it would be the last time he'd see her. The question that haunted them. What happened in those 400 yards? What happened to our daughter between the bus stop and home? That question would haunt Bob and Sally Dowler, and the detectives assigned to find Millie, for nearly a decade. Because what came next would be one of the longest, most emotionally devastating investigations in British history. And when the truth finally came out, it would break the hearts of detectives who had dedicated years of their lives to finding answers. For 6 months after Millie disappeared, police searched everywhere. Hundreds of officers worked on the case. Volunteers handed out thousands of missing posters. Millie's face was on every TV screen in Britain. Bob and Sally Dowler appeared on television, begging for information. "Please, if you know anything about our daughter, tell us. We just want her home." Every day they hoped for good news. Every day the phone would ring with tips and possible sightings. Every day ended in disappointment. But they never gave up hope. As long as Millie hadn't been found, there was a chance she was still alive somewhere. September 18th, 2002, the day Hope died. 6 months after Millie vanished, a man was walking through Yateley Heath Woods in Hampshire, about 50 miles away from where Millie disappeared. He found something hidden in the woods that made him immediately call police. It was Millie, but she was gone. The little girl who had been walking home from school with her saxophone, who was just 400 yards from safety, would never come home. Bob and Sally's worst nightmare had come true. When a case goes cold, after Millie's body was found, police worked frantically to find who did this. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed every lead, they checked every piece of evidence, but they couldn't find the person responsible. Months turned into years. The case went cold. That means police ran out of leads to follow. They didn't know where to look next. But here's what most people don't understand. Just because a case goes cold doesn't mean detectives stop caring. The detective who carried Millie for 9 years. Detective Chief Inspector Maria Woodall was put in charge of finding Millie's killer. She was experienced, smart, and determined. But nobody, not even DCI Woodall, expected this investigation would take over her life for nearly a decade. For 9 years, Maria Woodall woke up every morning thinking about Millie. For 9 years, she went to bed every night, wondering if tomorrow would be the day they'd find the killer. She kept Millie's photo on her desk. She talked to Millie's parents regularly. She refused to give up. Other detectives on her team said, "We carried Millie with us for nearly a decade. She never left our minds." Living with a case. Every single day. Imagine working on the same case for 9 years. Think about that. These detectives went to work every day for 9 years trying to solve Millie's murder. They reviewed the same evidence over and over, hoping to spot something new, re-interviewed witnesses years later to see if they remembered anything else. Followed hundreds of false leads that went nowhere. Watched Millie's parents age and suffer, unable to give them answers. One officer said, "I have children the same age Millie would have been. As my kids grew up, graduated, got jobs, I thought about Millie. She never got to do any of that." The family liaison officers. Special police officers were assigned to stay in contact with Bob and Sally Dowler throughout the entire investigation. These officers became like family. They attended Millie's memorial service. They were there on her birthday every year. They called on Christmas and holidays to check on the family. They watched Bob and Sally struggle with grief for 9 years. They saw Millie's sister Gemma try to move forward with her life while carrying the weight of losing her little sister. These officers weren't just doing a job anymore. They loved this family. They felt their pain, and they desperately wanted to give them justice. The psychological strain of false hope. The worst part of a long investigation? False leads that make you think you've finally solved it, only to discover you're wrong. For 9 years, the investigation team experienced this over and over. A witness would come forward with new information, but it led nowhere. DNA evidence would be tested, but it didn't match anyone in the database. A suspect would be identified, but they had an alibi. Evidence would be re-examined with new technology, but still no breakthrough. Every false lead was like climbing a mountain, reaching the top, and realizing you climbed the wrong mountain. The phone hacking scandal. Cruelty beyond belief. In 2011, something absolutely heartbreaking was discovered. Remember how Bob and Sally kept calling Millie's phone after she disappeared, hoping she'd answer? Her voicemail box filled up with messages from her worried parents. Then, a few days after she vanished, some of those voicemails were deleted. The voicemail box had space again. Bob and Sally thought, "Millie must be alive. She's checking her messages." They felt hope for the first time in days. They thought their daughter was out there somewhere, listening to their messages. But the truth was so much worse. Journalists from a newspaper had hacked into Millie's phone and deleted voicemails so they could leave more messages, hoping Millie would call back and they'd get a story. They gave Millie's parents false hope during the worst time of their lives, just to get a news story. When detectives found out about this years later, they were furious. One officer said, "I've seen terrible things in my career, but that level of cruelty to a grieving family, I'll never understand it." 2008. A name emerges. 6 years after Millie was murdered, detectives were investigating a man named Levi Belfield for 2 other murders, the killings of Marcia McDonnell and Amélie Delagrange. As they built their case against Belfield, something caught their attention. In March 2002, the exact time Millie disappeared, Levi Belfield lived just minutes away from where she vanished. He drove a red car that matched witness descriptions. He had no alibi for that day. Could this be the breakthrough they'd been waiting for? On March 30th, 2011, 9 years and 9 days after Millie disappeared, police finally had enough evidence to charge Levi Belfield with her murder. DCI Maria Woodall, who had worked on this case for nearly a decade, was the one who made the arrest. Imagine that moment. 9 years of work. 9 years of carrying Millie's photo. 9 years of promising her parents they wouldn't give up. And finally, they had him. The moment. Everything changed. When DCI Woodall called Bob and Sally Dowler to tell them about the arrest, she could barely speak. After 9 years of disappointing phone calls, 9 years of "we're still working on it," she finally had the words they'd been waiting for. "We've arrested someone for Millie's murder." Bob and Sally didn't celebrate. They didn't cheer. They just cried. Because after 9 years, they finally had an answer. They finally knew who took their daughter away. The weight they carried. When the arrest was made, several officers on the investigation team broke down crying. Not tears of joy, tears of relief mixed with exhaustion and grief. One detective said, "For 9 years, I went to bed every night feeling like I'd failed Millie. Every birthday she missed, every Christmas her parents spent without her. I felt responsible, we all did." Another officer described it like this: "Imagine carrying a heavy backpack for 9 years. You can't take it off. You can't put it down. It's with you every moment of every day. That's what this case felt like." The toll on their families. These detectives didn't just carry Millie at work. They brought her home with them. Officers' spouses said their partners would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about the case. They'd be at family dinners, but their minds would be on Millie. They'd see teenage girls walking home from school and think, that should have been Millie. One detective's daughter asked him, "Dad, why do you have that girl's picture on your desk at home?" He answered, "Because I made her a promise that I'd find who hurt her. And I keep my promises." His daughter was quiet for a moment, then said, "Did you keep your promise?" He replied, "Yes." Finally, yes. The bond with Millie's family. For 9 years, the family liaison officers stayed close to Bob, Sally, and Gemma Dowler. They weren't just police officers anymore. They were part of the family's grief journey. They celebrated small victories together, like when new evidence was found. They cried together when leads went nowhere. They supported each other through the darkest days. When the arrest was finally made, one family liaison officer hugged Sally Dowler and said, "We told you we'd never give up. We meant it." Sally replied, "I know you did. You've been with us every step of this nightmare. You're family now." Why? This case was different. Most murder investigations are solved within days or weeks, but Millie's case took 9 years. Think about what that means for the detectives. They worked on this case longer than Millie had been alive. They aged 9 years while Millie stayed forever. 13. They watched technology change, methods improve, but still couldn't solve it. They never gave up, even when it seemed impossible. DCI Maria Woodall said, "Some people asked me why I didn't move on to other cases. How could I? Millie deserved justice. Her family deserved answers. I wasn't going to stop until we got both." The price of justice. By the time Levi Belfield was arrested in 2011, the investigation had involved over 100 detectives, cost millions of pounds, taken thousands of hours of police work, consumed 9 years of people's lives. But to the officers who worked on it, none of that mattered. What mattered was keeping a promise to a 13-year-old girl and her family. The human cost. Several officers who worked on Millie's case needed counseling after the arrest. The psychological weight of carrying an unsolved murder for 9 years had taken its toll. One officer said, "People think we're tough. We are, but we're also human." And carrying Millie's case for 9 years, watching her parents suffer, knowing we couldn't give them answers, it broke something in all of us. But he added, we'd do it again, every single one of us would do it again, because that's what Millie deserved. The investigation that never ended. Even though Levi Belfield was arrested in 2011, the work wasn't over. Now came the trial. Now came the hardest part, proving in court that he was guilty. And for DCI Maria Woodall and her team, that meant reliving 9 years of investigation, presenting every piece of evidence, and finally, getting justice for Millie Dowler. The question was, after 9 years of carrying this weight, could the detectives hold it together long enough to see justice served? The answer would come in the courtroom, and it would break hearts all over again. The Old Bailey is one of the most famous courthouses in the world. It's where the most serious crimes in Britain are tried. It's a place where justice is supposed to be served. In June 2011, Levi Belfield stood trial for the murder of Millie Dowler. After 9 years of investigation, after 9 years of carrying Millie's memory, the detectives finally had their day in court, but nobody was prepared for how painful it would be. The detectives take the stand. One by one, the detectives who had worked on Millie's case for 9 years had to testify. That means they had to stand in front of the courtroom and answer questions about the investigation. DCI Maria Woodall was the first to testify. She had led this investigation for nearly a decade. She had promised Millie's parents she would find justice. Now, she had to relive every moment of those 9 years in front of a courtroom full of people. As she began to speak, her voice was strong and professional. But then the prosecutor asked her, "Detective Woodall, can you describe what it was like to work on this case for 9 years?" Maria Woodall paused. She looked at Bob and Sally Dowler sitting in the courtroom. She looked at the photo of Millie that was displayed for the jury. And then, this tough detective who had worked hundreds of cases, who had seen terrible things, who had stayed strong for 9 years, broke down crying. When strong people break. The courtroom went silent as DCI Woodall tried to compose herself. She wiped her eyes and said, "I'm sorry. It's just, we carried Millie with us every single day for 9 years. Every birthday she missed. Every Christmas her family spent without her. Every time we had to tell her parents we still didn't have answers, it broke our hearts," she continued. "We felt like we'd failed her. Every day that passed without solving this case felt like we were letting Millie down. We were letting her family down." Even the judge, Sir Brian Levison, a man who had presided over hundreds of serious trials, had tears in his eyes. The defense's cruel tactics. Here's where things got even worse. Levi Belfield's defense lawyers tried to blame other people for Millie's murder. They suggested maybe it was someone else. They questioned every piece of evidence. They tried to create doubt. That's their job, to defend their client. But the way they did it was brutal. They made detectives relive every mistake, every missed clue, every moment they wished they could do over. They questioned whether the investigation was done properly. They suggested the police had gotten it wrong. For detectives who had given 9 years of their lives to this case, who had sacrificed time with their own families to find justice for Millie, this felt like being stabbed in the heart. One officer later said, "I understood they were doing their job, but listening to them suggest we didn't care enough, didn't work hard enough, after 9 years of living and breathing this case, it destroyed me," testifying about finding Millie. The hardest testimony came when detectives had to describe finding Millie's remains in Yateley Heath Woods. Officers who had been at the scene had to stand in front of the courtroom and describe what they found. They had to look at photos. They had to relive that terrible day in September 2002 when Hope died. As one detective testified about the moment they realized it was Millie, the entire courtroom began to weep. Jurors cried. Lawyers cried. Court staff cried. Bob and Sally Dowler held each other and sobbed. The detective on the stand couldn't continue. He broke down completely, saying, "I have a daughter. She was the same age as Millie. When I found her, all I could think was, this is someone's little girl. This is someone's baby?" The judge called a recess because too many people in the courtroom were crying to continue. Bob Dowler's victim impact statement. Near the end of the trial, Bob Dowler, Millie's father, was allowed to read a victim impact statement. This is where he could tell the court how Millie's murder had affected his family. Bob stood up, holding a piece of paper with shaking hands. He looked at Levi Belfield, the man who had murdered his daughter, and then he spoke. "You took our daughter. You took our sunshine. You took the girl who made us laugh, who played saxophone, who had her whole life ahead of her." His voice broke. "For 9 years, we didn't know what happened to Millie. For 9 years, we lived in agony. Every day we wondered if she suffered. Every day we wondered if she was scared. Every day we wondered if she called out for us." Bob looked directly at the detective sitting in the courtroom. These officers never gave up on Millie. When we had no hope left, they kept searching. They kept their promise to find who did this. They gave us justice when we thought we'd never get it. Every detective in that courtroom was crying openly. These tough, experienced officers, who had seen the worst of humanity, were weeping like children. June 23, 2011. The verdict. After weeks of testimony, after reliving 9 years of investigation, after countless tears and breakdowns, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty. Levi Belfield was found guilty of murdering Millie Dowler. When the verdict was read, DCI Maria Woodall collapsed in her seat, sobbing. 9 years of wait, 9 years of pressure, 9 years of carrying Millie's memory. It all came pouring out. Other detectives hugged each other, crying. They had done it. They had kept their promise to Millie. They had gotten justice. But the victory felt hollow, because Millie was still gone, and the 9 years they'd spent carrying her case had changed them forever. After the trial ended, multiple officers from the investigation team needed long-term counseling. They were diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's a condition that happens when someone experiences something so traumatic, so painful, that their brain can't process it normally. These weren't soldiers coming back from war. These were police detectives who had spent 9 years trying to get justice for a murdered child. One officer described it like this: "I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Millie's face. I saw her parents crying. I saw the woods where we found her. It played in my head like a movie that never stopped." Another detective said, "I'd be at home with my own kids and suddenly I'd start crying. My daughter would ask, 'Dad, what's wrong?' How do you explain to a child that you're crying for another child you never met but carried in your heart for 9 years? The nightmares that followed. DCI Maria Woodall later admitted that for years after the trial she had nightmares. She would dream that they'd gotten it wrong, that Belfield was innocent, that the real killer was still out there. She would wake up in a panic, checking her phone to make sure the conviction was real. "Even though we won, even though we got justice, my brain couldn't let go," she said. "For 9 years, this case was my life. When it ended, I didn't know who I was anymore without it." Other officers reported similar experiences, panic attacks when they saw teenage girls walking alone, crying unexpectedly, when they heard certain songs or saw certain places, avoiding the area where Millie disappeared because it was too painful, struggling to work on other cases because nothing felt as important. How one case changed everything. The Millie Dowler case didn't just affect the detectives who worked on it. It changed how police across the entire United Kingdom handle missing persons cases. Before Millie, police departments didn't always have proper mental health support for officers working on child murder cases. After Millie, everything changed. New rules were created. Mandatory counseling. Detectives working on child murder cases now must see a counselor regularly, not just after the case ends. Rotation systems. Officers can't work on the same traumatic case for years without breaks. They need time away to protect their mental health. Support teams. Special teams were created to help detectives cope with the emotional weight of these cases. Family time protection. Police departments now make sure detectives have time with their own families, even during major investigations. One police chief said, "We learned from Millie's case that we can't ask our officers to carry that weight alone. We have to support them or we'll break them." Case 4. Shannon Matthews. The disappearance that united Britain. February 19, 2008. Dewsbury Moor, West Yorkshire. Shannon Matthews was 9 years old. She had blonde hair, a bright smile, and loved swimming. On February 19, 2008, Shannon left Westmore Primary School at 3:10 p.m., just like she did every day. She was supposed to walk home. It was only a short distance, but Shannon never made it home. When a mother realizes her child is gone. At first, Shannon's mom, Karen Matthews, thought maybe Shannon had gone to a friend's house. Kids do that sometimes. They forget to tell their parents where they're going. But as the hours passed and Shannon didn't come home, Karen started to panic. By 6 p.m., she called the police. By 7 p.m., officers were searching the neighborhood. By 8 p.m., every parent in Dewsbury Moor was terrified. A community comes together. Here's what made Shannon's case special. The entire community immediately came together to find her. Dewsbury Moor is a working-class area. That means most people there don't have a lot of money. They work hard jobs, live in small houses, and struggle to pay bills. But when Shannon disappeared, none of that mattered. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before knocked on doors together, searching for Shannon. People took time off work to help look for her. Strangers became friends united by one goal: bring Shannon home. One neighbor said, "We might not have much money, but we take care of our own. Shannon was one of ours, and we weren't going to stop looking until we found her." The tearful mother, Karen Matthews, appeared on television, begging for Shannon's safe return. She cried as she spoke. "Please, if anyone has seen Shannon, if anyone knows where she is, please bring her back to me. She's just a little girl. She needs her mom." The entire country watched Karen's tearful pleas. Millions of people felt their hearts break for this mother who just wanted her daughter home. Detective Superintendent Andy Brennan, who led the investigation, said, "When I saw Karen crying on television, when I saw how desperate she was, I made a promise. We will find Shannon, whatever it takes." Something remarkable happened after Shannon disappeared. People from all over Britain, rich and poor, north and south, came together to help find her. The community raised over $50,000 as reward money for information about Shannon. That's a huge amount of money, especially for a working-class area. Volunteers traveled from other cities to help search. People printed thousands of posters with Shannon's face. News channels covered the story every single day. One reporter said, "Shannon's disappearance reminded Britain that it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. When a child goes missing, we all feel the pain." The comparison nobody wanted to make. Just 1 year earlier, in 2007, another little girl had disappeared, Madeleine McCann. Madeleine was 3 years old when she vanished while on vacation in Portugal with her wealthy parents. The media covered Madeleine's case constantly. Celebrities donated money. The investigation received millions of pounds in funding. But some people noticed something uncomfortable. Shannon Matthews was getting less media attention than Madeleine McCann. Why? Because Shannon's family was poor and Madeleine's family was wealthy. People started asking, does Britain care less about missing children from poor families? This question made the entire country uncomfortable, and it made people even more determined to find Shannon, to prove that every child matters, regardless of how much money their family has. The search begins. Detective Superintendent Andy Brennan assembled a massive team. Hundreds of officers searched every street, every park, every building in Dewsbury Moor. Volunteers walked through fields and forests, calling Shannon's name. Helicopters flew overhead with heat-sensing cameras. Divers searched ponds and rivers. Every single person involved had the same thought. We have to find her. We have to bring Shannon home. But nobody, not the detectives, not the volunteers, not the millions of people watching on television, could have predicted what they were about to discover. Because sometimes the most heartbreaking betrayals come from the people who are supposed to love us most. For 24 days, Britain held its breath. Every single day, thousands of people searched for Shannon Matthews. They walked through streets, knocked on doors, searched gardens, looked in sheds and garages. More than 3,000 volunteers showed up every day to help. That's like filling 50 school buses with people, all looking for one little girl. People took vacation days from work. Students skipped classes. Retired grandparents walked for hours in the cold. Everyone wanted to help bring Shannon home. A nation united by yellow ribbons. Someone had an idea. What if everyone wore yellow ribbons to show support for Shannon? Yellow became Shannon's color, the color of hope. Soon, yellow ribbons appeared everywhere, tied to trees and lampposts, pinned to jackets and coats, hanging in shop windows, attached to car antennas. If you walk through any town in Britain during those 24 days, you'd see yellow ribbons everywhere. It was the country's way of saying, we haven't forgotten Shannon, we won't give up. One volunteer said, every time I saw a yellow ribbon, it reminded me why we were searching. We were searching for hope. We were searching for a miracle. When celebrities joined the fight, famous people started talking about Shannon on television. Soccer players wore yellow ribbons during games. Musicians mentioned Shannon at concerts. News anchors wore yellow ribbons while reading the news. This wasn't just a local story anymore. This was a national movement. The message was clear. Shannon Matthews matters. Every child matters. The detectives who couldn't sleep. Detective Superintendent Andy Brennan barely slept during those 24 days. He worked 18-hour days, sometimes 20 hours. Other detectives did the same. They couldn't go home and relax knowing Shannon was still missing. One officer said, how could I go home and tuck my own kids into bed knowing Shannon was out there somewhere? I couldn't. So I kept searching. The detectives held press conferences every few days, updating the public on the search. With each conference, Andy Brennan looked more tired, more desperate, more determined. He would stand in front of cameras and say, we will bring Shannon home. We will not stop until we find her. That phrase, we will bring Shannon home, became something the entire country repeated. It was a promise, a prayer, a hope. The family liaison team. Special officers were assigned to stay with Karen Matthews and her family. These officers, called the family liaison team, were there to support the family and keep them updated on the investigation. These officers spent every day with Karen. They saw her cry, They heard her beg for Shannon's return. They held her hand during press conferences. One liaison officer later said, "I felt like Karen was my sister. Her pain became my pain. I wanted to find Shannon not just as a police officer, but as someone who cared deeply about this family." The detectives weren't just doing their job anymore. This had become personal. March 14th, 2008. The miracle. On the 24th day of searching, detectives received a tip about a man named Michael Donovan. Michael lived less than a mile from Shannon's house, so close you could walk there in 15 minutes. Officers went to Michael's flat to investigate. It was a small, messy apartment. They searched the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom. Then they looked in the bedroom. There was a divan bed. That's a bed with a base that has storage space underneath. One officer noticed the base looked strange. He bent down and looked closer. And then he heard something. Breathing. Someone was hiding inside the base of the bed. The officer's heart started racing. He called out, "Shannon? Shannon Matthews?" A small, scared voice answered, "Yes." She was alive. Officers carefully opened the base of the bed, and there she was, Shannon Matthews, alive. She was dirty, scared, and confused, but she was alive. The officer who found her started crying immediately. He radioed to the other officers, "We've got her. Shannon's alive. We found her." The celebration. When news spread that Shannon had been found alive, the entire country erupted in celebration. In Dewsbury Moor, people ran into the streets, hugging strangers, crying tears of joy. At the police station, detectives who had worked 18-hour days for 24 straight days collapsed in relief. They hugged each other. They cried. They laughed. Detective Superintendent Andy Brennan, this tough, experienced officer who had led the investigation, broke down, sobbing. "We did it," he kept saying. "We saved her. We brought her home." Cameras captured the moment. Police officers with tears streaming down their faces, celebrating the miracle they'd been praying for. One officer said, "In 20 years of police work, this was the happiest moment of my career. We saved a child's life. We brought her home to her mother." The entire country celebrated. News channels showed footage of the yellow ribbons, the volunteers, the community that never gave up. Britain had come together and Britain had won. Shannon Matthews was home. The nightmare was over. Or so everyone thought. Remember how everyone celebrated when Shannon was found alive? Remember the detectives crying tears of joy? Remember the entire country celebrating the miracle? That joy lasted exactly a few hours, because as detectives questioned Shannon and investigated Michael Donovan's flat, they started noticing things that didn't make sense. And what they discovered was so horrible, so unbelievable, that it would break the hearts of everyone who had searched for Shannon. The truth. Nobody wanted to believe. Shannon told detectives that Michael Donovan had kept her hidden under the bed for 24 days. He gave her medicine that made her sleepy. He told her she couldn't leave or make noise. But here's what made detectives suspicious. Shannon said Michael told her this was all part of a game. He said her mom knew about it. At first, detectives thought Shannon was confused. Maybe the trauma of being kidnapped had mixed up her memories. But then they found something in Michael Donovan's flat, text messages between him and Karen Matthews. Text messages that proved Karen had planned the entire thing. The plan that destroyed everything. Here's what actually happened. Karen Matthews, Shannon's own mother, had planned to kidnap her own daughter. She asked Michael Donovan, who was dating her brother-in-law, to hide Shannon in his flat. The plan was simple and evil. Hide Shannon for a few weeks. Let the community raise reward money. Find Shannon and claim to be a hero. Collect the $50,000 reward money. Split the money between Karen and Michael. Shannon's own mother had put her through 24 days of terror. Being drugged, hidden under a bed, scared and alone, all for money. When detectives realized the truth, Detective Superintendent Andy Brennan was the one who first saw the evidence. He sat in his office, reading the text messages between Karen and Michael, and he felt physically sick. This was the woman he had comforted, the woman he had promised to help, the woman whose hand he had held during press conferences, and she had been lying the entire time. Andy later said, "In that moment, I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. All I could feel was rage and heartbreak." Other detectives had the same reaction. The officers who had worked 18-hour days for 24 straight days felt betrayed. The family liaison team, who had spent every day with Karen, felt sick. One officer said, "We had cried with her. We had hugged her. We had told her we'd bring Shannon home. And the whole time, she knew exactly where Shannon was because she had put her there." The community's heartbreak. When the truth came out, the 3,000 volunteers who had searched for Shannon felt devastated. These were people who had taken time off work, walked for hours in the cold, knocked on thousands of doors, all to find a little girl whose own mother had hidden her. One volunteer said, "I have never felt so betrayed in my entire life. We gave everything we had to find Shannon, and it was all a lie." The yellow ribbons that had symbolized hope now symbolized shame. Dewsbury Moor, the community that had united Britain, now felt humiliated. People across the country started saying cruel things about the town, about the people who lived there. One resident said, "We went from being heroes to being a joke. And it wasn't our fault. We were victims of Karen's lies too." The trial that broke. Detectives. In January 2009, Karen Matthews and Michael Donovan went on trial. Detectives had to testify in court about what happened. They had to stand in front of a judge and jury and describe how Karen had betrayed everyone. And that's when something remarkable happened. These tough, experienced police officers broke down crying in court. Detective Superintendent Andy Brennan testified, "When I realized what Karen had done, I felt anger like I'd never felt before. But more than anger, I felt grief. Grief for Shannon, who had been betrayed by the one person who should have protected her. Grief for the community that had given everything to find her. And grief for my team, who had poured their hearts into this case." He paused, tears streaming down his face. "We had held Karen's hand. We had cried with her. We had promised her we'd bring Shannon home. And the whole time, she had done this to her own child. For money." Other officers testified with similar emotion. One officer said, "I have children of my own. I cannot imagine doing to them what Karen did to Shannon. It broke something inside me. It made me question everything." Another detective said, "After Shannon's case, I never looked at families the same way again. I never trusted tears the same way again. Karen Matthews stole something from us. She stole our ability to believe in people." Both Karen Matthews and Michael Donovan were found guilty. They were each sentenced to 8 years in prison. When the verdict was read, detectives in the courtroom didn't celebrate. They just sat there, exhausted and heartbroken. One officer said, "We got justice for Shannon, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like everyone had lost." The scars that never healed. After the trial, multiple officers from Shannon's case needed counseling. They struggled with trust issues. They had nightmares. They questioned whether they could continue working as detectives. One officer said, "Karen Matthews broke something in me. She made me doubt my ability to read people. If I couldn't see through her lies, how could I trust myself on other cases? Detective Superintendent Andy Brennan later admitted. Shannon's case was the hardest of my career. Not because we failed, we saved Shannon's life, but because the person we were fighting to help was the person who had hurt her in the first place. How one case changed everything. Shannon Matthews' case didn't just hurt the detectives who worked on it. It changed how police across Britain handle missing children cases. Before Shannon, police always trusted parents who made tearful appeals on television. After Shannon, everything changed. Now, detectives have to consider that sometimes the person crying on TV might be the person who caused the crime. Police developed new training programs called family deception recognition. Detectives learned to look for warning signs that a parent might be lying. They started checking parents' phones and computers more carefully. They started asking tougher questions. They started trusting their instincts when something felt wrong. One police trainer said, "Shannon Matthews taught us a painful lesson. Love doesn't always mean protection. Sometimes the most dangerous person in a child's life is the person who's supposed to love them most." What happened to Shannon? After the trial, Shannon was taken into care. She was given a new identity and moved far away from Dewsbury Moor. The government wanted to protect her from the media attention and give her a chance at a normal life. Today, Shannon is an adult. She lives under a different name. Very few people know who she really is. One social worker who helped Shannon said, "Shannon is a survivor. What her mother did to her was terrible, but Shannon is strong. She deserves privacy and peace." What happened to Karen Matthews? Karen Matthews served half of her 8-year sentence, just 4 years in prison. She was released in 2012 and given a new identity to protect her from public anger. Many people were furious that she only served 4 years for what she did to Shannon. One Dewsbury resident said, "4 years, that's nothing. She destroyed her daughter's childhood, betrayed an entire community, and wasted thousands of hours of police time. And she only got 4 years?" Karen Matthews now lives somewhere in England under a fake name. By law, nobody is allowed to reveal her location or identity. The community that never forgot. Dewsbury Moor never fully recovered from Shannon's case. The town that had been praised for coming together became known as the place where that terrible mother lived. The yellow ribbons were taken down. The posters were removed. People wanted to forget. But the volunteers who searched for Shannon never forgot what they had done. They had shown the world what real community spirit looks like, even if it was all based on a lie. One volunteer said years later, "We did the right thing. We searched for a missing child. The fact that her mother was evil doesn't change the fact that we were good people trying to help." The detectives who carry the scars. Detective Superintendent Andy Brennan retired from the police force a few years after Shannon's case. He said the case had changed him too much. He couldn't look at crying parents the same way anymore. He couldn't trust people the same way anymore. In his final interview before retirement, he said, "Shannon Matthews' case taught me that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes evil looks like a crying mother on television. Sometimes evil looks normal, and that's what makes it so dangerous." Other detectives from the case also struggled. Some needed therapy, some changed careers. Some still have nightmares about the moment they realized Karen had been lying all along. One detective said, "People think the hard part of police work is catching criminals. But the hardest part is when the criminal is someone you trusted, someone you cried with, someone you promised to help." The closing message. Shannon Matthews' case reminds us of something important. Sometimes the monster isn't hiding in the shadows. Sometimes the monster is standing right in front of you, crying fake tears. asking for help finding the child they hid themselves. And sometimes the real heroes aren't the ones who solve the case. They're the ones who have to live with the heartbreak of discovering the truth. Case 5. Arthur Lebenjo Hughes, the boy behind closed doors. Solihull, West Midlands. Arthur Lebenjo Hughes was 6 years old. He had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. He loved superheroes, especially Spider-Man. He loved playing outside. He loved his grandparents. But in June 2020, Arthur's world changed forever. And what happened to him behind closed doors would shock an entire nation and make even the toughest detectives break down in tears. When the world locked down. In March 2020, something scary happened all over the world. COVID-19. You probably remember this. Schools closed. People had to stay home. Parents couldn't go to work. Everyone was locked inside their houses for months. For most kids, lockdown was boring, but safe. You were stuck at home with your family, doing online school, missing your friends. But for Arthur, lockdown became a nightmare. Because Arthur was trapped inside a house with two people who were supposed to protect him, but instead they hurt him every single day. Arthur's mom and dad had separated when he was very young. Arthur lived with his dad, Thomas Hughes. In 2019, Thomas started dating a woman named Emma Tustin. Emma seemed nice at first. She smiled a lot. She said she wanted to be a good stepmom to Arthur, but Emma Tustin was hiding something dark inside her. When COVID-19 lockdown started in March 2020, Thomas, Emma, and Arthur were all stuck in the same house together. Arthur couldn't go to school. He couldn't see his grandparents. He couldn't escape. And that's when the abuse began. The boy who became invisible. Before lockdown, Arthur was a normal, happy 6-year-old boy. He went to school, he played with friends. Teachers said he was polite and cheerful. But during lockdown, something changed. Arthur's grandparents tried to visit, but Emma and Thomas made excuses. Arthur's sick. We're worried about COVID. Maybe next week. Arthur's uncle tried to FaceTime him, but Thomas always said Arthur was sleeping or busy. Slowly, Arthur disappeared from everyone's life. The people who loved him couldn't see him anymore. Couldn't check if he was okay, couldn't save him. One of Arthur's uncles later said, "We knew something was wrong, we could feel it, but we couldn't get to him." COVID gave them the perfect excuse to hide what they were doing. The torture behind closed doors. What Emma Tustin and Thomas Hughes did to Arthur is almost impossible to believe. They starved him. Arthur, a growing 6-year-old boy, was given barely any food. He became so thin you could see his bones. They forced him to stand in the hallway for hours and hours, sometimes 14 hours a day. If he tried to sit down or lean against the wall, they would yell at him or hurt him. They made him sleep on the floor with just a thin blanket, even though there were beds in the house. They poisoned him with salt. Emma would force Arthur to eat or drink things with dangerous amounts of salt in them, which made him sick and weak. They hit him, they shook him, they called him terrible names. And the worst part? Emma Tustin had cameras set up all over the house. She would watch Arthur on her phone while he stood in the hallway suffering. Sometimes she would record him and send the videos to Thomas, and they would laugh about it. The boy who kept hoping. Even though Arthur was being hurt every day, he never stopped hoping things would get better. In some of the audio recordings that were later found, you can hear Arthur's small voice saying things like, "I'm sorry, I'll be good. Please, I'm hungry. No one loves me." Arthur was 6 years old. He should have been playing with toys and watching cartoons. Instead, he was begging for food and apologizing for existing. One detective who listened to those recordings later said, "Hearing Arthur's voice broke me. He was just a little boy. He didn't understand why this was happening to him. He thought it was his fault." The neighbors who heard something. Arthur lived in a regular neighborhood in Solihull. There were houses on both sides, people walking their dogs, kids riding bikes, and some of those neighbors heard things that worried them. They heard shouting coming from the house. They heard crying. They heard banging sounds. One neighbor said, "I heard a child crying and screaming multiple times. It sounded like someone was really hurting him. But I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe I was overreacting." Another neighbor said, "I heard a man's voice shouting terrible things at a child, things no adult should ever say to a kid. I wish I'd called the police sooner." Looking back, these neighbors carry guilt with them. They wonder, could we have saved Arthur if we had acted sooner? But here's the truth. Arthur's abuse was happening behind closed doors during a pandemic when everyone was told to stay inside and mind their own business. The neighbors didn't know how bad it really was. June 16th, 2020, the day. Everything changed. On June 16th, 2020, Emma Tustin was alone in the house with Arthur. Thomas had gone to run errands, leaving Arthur with Emma. What happened next is almost too horrible to describe. Emma Tustin violently assaulted Arthur. She hurt him so badly that his little body couldn't take it anymore. At 2:29 p.m., Emma called 999. That's the emergency number in the UK, like 911 in America. She told the operator that Arthur had hurt himself. She said he had banged his head on the floor, but that was a lie. When paramedics arrived at the house, they found Arthur unconscious on the floor. His body was covered in bruises. He was dangerously thin. He looked like he hadn't been fed in weeks. The paramedics were shocked. One of them later said, "In all my years as a paramedic, I had never seen a child in such terrible condition. Arthur looked like a child from a war zone, not a child from a normal neighborhood in England." They rushed Arthur to Birmingham Children's Hospital, desperately trying to save his life. But Arthur's injuries were too severe. The doctors who couldn't save him. At the hospital, doctors and nurses worked frantically to help Arthur. They discovered he had suffered a catastrophic brain injury. Someone had violently shaken him or slammed his head with tremendous force. But that wasn't all they found. Arthur's body told a story of months of abuse. He was severely malnourished and dehydrated. He had over 130 bruises covering his body. He had salt poisoning in his system. His organs were shutting down from starvation. One doctor said, "I've worked in pediatric medicine for 20 years. Arthur's injuries were among the worst I've ever seen. This wasn't an accident. This was systematic torture of a child. The medical team did everything they could, but Arthur's brain injury was too severe." June 17th, 2020, 1 a.m. Less than 12 hours after arriving at the hospital, Arthur Labinjo Hughes died. He was 6 years old. The doctors and nurses who had tried to save him were devastated. Some of them cried. Some of them had to take breaks because they were so upset. One nurse said, "We see sick children every day. That's our job." But Arthur was different. Arthur didn't die from an illness or an accident. Arthur died because the people who were supposed to love him chose to hurt him instead. When police arrived, while doctors were trying to save Arthur, police officers arrived at the hospital. They needed to understand what had happened. They needed to talk to Emma Tustin and Thomas Hughes. Emma stuck to her story. Arthur had hurt himself. She said he had been acting strange all day and had banged his own head on the floor. But the doctors told police that was impossible. Arthur's injuries couldn't have been self-inflicted. Someone had violently attacked him. Police arrested Emma Tustin immediately. They also arrested Thomas Hughes, who had returned home and was acting like nothing had happened. The House of Horrors. When police searched the house where Arthur had lived, they were horrified by what they found. They discovered Emma's cameras and audio recordings. hours and hours of footage showing Arthur's suffering. They found videos of Arthur standing in the hallway, barely able to hold himself up, crying softly. They found audio recordings of Emma and Thomas screaming at Arthur, calling him terrible names, threatening him. They found text messages between Emma and Thomas where they talked about hurting Arthur and laughed about his suffering. One detective said, "Walking through that house, knowing what had happened to Arthur there, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Every room told a story of abuse. Every recording broke my heart a little more." The evidence that made detectives cry, the most devastating evidence, was the recordings from the last day of Arthur's life. In one audio clip, you can hear Arthur's weak little voice saying, "No one loves me." In another, he says, "No one's going to feed me." These recordings were played during the investigation, and multiple detectives had to leave the room because they were crying too hard to continue. Detective Inspector Laura Harrison, who led the investigation, later said, "I have 2 children of my own. Listening to Arthur's voice, hearing his pain, knowing we couldn't save him, it destroyed me. I went home that night and held my kids and cried for hours." The community's shock. When news broke that a 6-year-old boy had died from abuse in Solihull, the community was stunned. Solihull is a nice area. It's not a place where people expect terrible things to happen. It's full of families and schools and parks. But Arthur had been suffering right there, behind a normal-looking door, on a normal-looking street. People started leaving flowers and teddy bears outside Arthur's house. They left notes saying, "We're sorry we didn't save you," and "Rest in peace, little angel." One neighbor said, "I keep thinking about all the times I heard crying from that house and didn't do anything. I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life." The boy who deserved better. Arthur Labinjo Hughes should be alive today. He should be 11 years old, in school, playing with friends, growing up. Instead, his short life ended in pain and fear. But his story would change everything. It would force an entire nation to ask difficult questions about how we protect children. And it would break the hearts of every detective, doctor, and social worker who tried and failed to save him. When Arthur died on June the 17th, 2020, police knew something terrible had happened. But they didn't know how terrible until they started investigating. What they found was so horrible that even the toughest police officers, people who had seen bad things for 20 or 30 years, couldn't handle it. Some of them cried. Some of them had nightmares. Some of them asked to be taken off the case because it was too painful. What the paramedics found. When paramedics first arrived at the house on June 16th, they were shocked by what they saw. Arthur wasn't just hurt. Arthur looked like he had been tortured for months. His body was covered in 130 bruises. That's not a few bruises from falling down. That's 130 separate injuries all over his little body. He was dangerously thin. You could see his bones through his skin. He looked like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks. The paramedics knew immediately this wasn't an accident. Someone had been hurting this child for a long, long time. One paramedic said, "I've helped sick children before, but Arthur was different. Arthur looked like someone had been deliberately starving and beating him. I'll never forget what he looked like." What the doctors discovered. At the hospital, doctors ran tests to understand what had happened to Arthur. They found something shocking. Arthur had salt poisoning in his body. Salt poisoning happens when someone eats or drinks way too much salt. It's extremely dangerous and can kill you. Emma Tustin had been forcing Arthur to eat or drink things with huge amounts of salt in them. She was literally poisoning him. Doctors also found that Arthur was severely dehydrated and malnourished. His body was shutting down because he hadn't been given enough food or water. One doctor said, "Arthur's body showed signs of long-term abuse." This wasn't something that happened in one day. This had been going on for months. The cameras that recorded everything. Remember how Emma Tustin had cameras set up all over the house? When police searched the house, they found those cameras and downloaded all the footage. What they saw made them sick. Hours and hours of video showing Arthur standing in the hallway, barely able to hold himself up. Videos of Arthur crying softly, too weak to even cry loudly. Videos of Arthur trying to pick up a blanket from the floor because he was cold, but being too weak to lift it. Detective Inspector Laura Harrison was in charge of the investigation. She had been a police officer for 25 years. She had seen terrible things before, but watching Arthur's videos broke her. She said, "I couldn't watch all the footage in one sitting. I had to keep taking breaks because I was crying too hard. Some of the videos I could only watch once. I'll never forget them. The audio that broke hearts." Even worse than the videos were the audio recordings. Emma's cameras also recorded sound, so police could hear everything that happened in that house. They heard Emma and Thomas screaming at Arthur, calling him horrible names. They heard Arthur's small voice begging for food. "Please, I'm hungry." They heard Arthur saying, "No one loves me." They heard Arthur saying, "No one's going to feed me." These recordings were played during the investigation, and multiple detectives had to leave the room because they were crying. One senior officer said, "In 25 years of policing, I've never seen anything that broke my heart like Arthur's voice begging for someone to love him." Another detective said, "Hearing a 6-year-old child say, 'No one loves me,' is something that will haunt me for the rest of my life." The text messages that proved it was planned. Police also found text messages between Emma Tustin and Thomas Hughes. These messages showed that they had been planning to hurt Arthur together. They talked about punishing him. They laughed about his suffering. In one message, Emma told Thomas about forcing Arthur to stand in the hallway for 14 hours straight. Thomas replied with a laughing emoji. In another message, Thomas told Emma to make sure Arthur didn't get any food. Emma replied, "Don't worry, I won't." These weren't accidents. These weren't moments of anger. This was planned, deliberate torture of a 6-year-old child. The investigation team had about 20 police officers working on Arthur's case. Within the first week, several officers asked to be taken off the case. They said they couldn't handle it emotionally. The officers who stayed needed immediate counseling. The police department brought in therapists to help them cope with what they were seeing and hearing. One detective said, "I have children Arthur's age. Every time I watched those videos or listened to those recordings, I saw my own kids. I went home every night and hugged my children and cried." Another officer said, "Hardened detectives, people who had worked murder cases for decades, walked out of viewing rooms crying. That's how bad it was." Some officers developed PTSD symptoms. They had nightmares about Arthur. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't eat. Detective Laura Harrison said, "This case changed all of us. We'll never be the same people we were before we met Arthur." In December 2021, Emma Tustin and Thomas Hughes went on trial at Coventry Crown Court. This wasn't just any trial. This was one of the most important child abuse trials in British history. The whole country was watching. Everyone wanted to know, would Arthur get justice? The courtroom was packed with people. There were police officers who had investigated Arthur's case. There were journalists reporting the story. There were members of the public who wanted to see justice done. And there were Emma Tustin and Thomas Hughes sitting in the dock, about to face the consequences of what they had done. The judge was Mr. Justice Mark Wall. He had been a judge for many years and had seen many terrible cases, but even he wasn't prepared for what he was about to hear. During the trial, the jury, the group of ordinary people who decide if someone is guilty, had to watch Arthur's videos and listen to his audio recordings. They had to see the text messages between Emma and Thomas. They had to hear from doctors about Arthur's injuries. And it was too much for many of them to handle. Jury members were seen crying during the trial. Some of them had to take breaks because they were so upset. One journalist who covered the trial said, "I've reported on many court cases, but I've never seen a jury cry like they did during Arthur's trial." Everyone in that courtroom was heartbroken. The police officers who investigated Arthur's case had to testify in court. They had to stand up in front of everyone and describe what they had found. And that's when something remarkable happened. These tough, experienced police officers broke down, crying on the witness stand. Detective Inspector Laura Harrison testified about watching Arthur's videos. She started crying so hard she had to stop talking. She said, "Arthur's voice recordings still haunt me. Every single day, I hear his little voice saying, 'No one loves me.' That sound will never leave my head." Other detectives had the same reaction. These were people who had been police officers for 20 or 30 years. They had seen terrible things before, but Arthur's case was different. Arthur's case broke them. The court had to take several breaks during the trial because the evidence was so distressing. Even the judge looked upset. After hearing all the evidence, the jury made their decision. Emma Tustin was found guilty of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. She has to serve at least 29 years before she can even ask to be released. Thomas Hughes was found guilty of manslaughter. That means the jury decided he didn't directly kill Arthur, but his actions helped cause Arthur's death. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison. When the verdicts were read, there was silence in the courtroom. Then some people started crying quietly. The judge, Mr. Justice Mark Wall, said something very important. He called what Emma and Thomas did a campaign of cruelty. That means it wasn't just one bad thing. It was months and months of deliberately hurting a little boy. We've talked about 5 heartbreaking cases, 5 children who died, 5 investigations that changed Britain. But there's one more story we need to tell. The story of what happened to the detectives who worked these cases. Because solving these crimes came at a terrible cost. Imagine being a police detective. Your job is to investigate crimes and catch criminals. Now imagine that your case involves a child who was hurt or killed. You have to look at photos of their injuries. You have to watch videos of their suffering. You have to listen to recordings of them crying. And you can never forget what you saw. Many detectives who work on child abuse cases develop something called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD means your brain can't stop thinking about the terrible things you've seen. You have nightmares. You feel anxious all the time. You can't sleep properly. In the UK, 35 out of every 100 detectives who investigate child cases develop PTSD. That's more than 1 in 3. One detective said, "After working on a child death case, I couldn't look at my own children without seeing the victim's face. I couldn't read them bedtime stories without crying. My family life fell apart." Why detectives leave? Because these cases are so painful, many detectives can't do the job for very long. Most detectives who work on child abuse cases leave within 5 years. They transfer to different departments or quit the police force entirely. They leave because the emotional pain is too much to handle. One former detective said, "I loved being a police officer, but after 3 child death cases, I couldn't do it anymore. Every case took a piece of my soul. Eventually, there was nothing left." Sadly, some detectives who investigate child abuse cases become so depressed that they harm themselves. The rate is higher among these investigators than regular police officers. It's not just the detectives who suffer. Their families suffer too. When a detective comes home after watching videos of a child being abused, they can't just forget about it. They're quiet at dinner. They can't sleep. They have nightmares. Their children notice something is wrong. One detective's wife said, "My husband worked on a child murder case. He came home different. He stopped smiling. He stopped playing with our kids. It was like the case had stolen the happy person I married." After these 5 cases, Britain realized something important. If we don't take care of our detectives, they can't take care of victims. So the government and police departments made big changes. Mandatory counseling. Now, every detective who works on a child death case must talk to a therapist. It's not optional anymore. Rotation policies. Detectives can't work on child abuse cases for too many years in a row. They have to take breaks and work on other types of cases. Peer support programs. Detectives who have worked difficult cases help newer detectives cope with the trauma. Mental health support. Police departments across the UK invested millions of pounds in programs to help officers' mental health. One police chief said, "We used to think detectives just needed to be tough. Now we understand that even the toughest person needs support when they see terrible things." From just these 5 cases alone, over 1,000 UK detectives needed trauma counseling. Each of these 5 cases led to new laws or new rules about how police work. The British government invested millions of pounds in detective mental health support. After Arthur's case, child protection referrals increased by 400%. That means 4 times as many people started reporting suspected child abuse. The final truth. These detectives didn't just investigate crimes. They carried the weight of these children's lives, their deaths, and the grief of millions of people. They broke down so that systems could be built up. They cried so that laws could change. They suffered so that future children might be saved. Detective Laura Harrison, who worked on Arthur's case, said it best. "We see things that nobody should ever have to see. We hear things that nobody should ever have to hear. We carry pain that nobody should ever have to carry, but we do it because someone has to speak for the children who can't speak for themselves." These 5 cases broke the hearts of millions across the UK. But from that heartbreak came change, came new laws, came better protection for children, came better support for the detectives who fight for them. And that's why these stories matter.